All right, welcome back everybody to our second module for our body systems. So this is module 17, and this is part 2 of our discussion of the body systems or the organ systems that we find in the human body. Now, we finished off in the last module discussing the reproductive system. We talked about the respiratory system, the circulatory system, the urinary system, and we're going to finish up our discussion on body systems talking about the endocrine system, the skeletal system, muscular system, and the nervous system. And so the first video in this module is going to look at the endocrine system. Okay, so the endocrine system is the body system that produces hormones that is used to control and regulate kind of all of the processes that happen within the body. And it does so in coordination with the nervous system. So the nervous system will kind of send stimuli and electrical signals to tell specific organs to produce hormones and release those hormones or to not release those hormones based off of some sort of value of some set function in the body. So for example, blood glucose or oxygen levels in the blood, or the amount of red blood cells that are in the blood, etc. Right. So all of that is regulated by hormones, and so hormones are the molecular signals that can stimulate a response in cells that have receptors that are able to bind to those molecules. And many of the hormones, like I had mentioned, are released in response to some sort of signal that comes from the nervous system. And whenever we talk about the nervous system in a different video in this module, you'll see exactly how those signals make it to the specific organ or gland that is secreting that hormone. Now, for the endocrine system, so endo basically means that those hormones are released into body fluids, and specifically the blood. So those hormones will be released into the bloodstream so that they can travel throughout the body and interact with whatever organ or cells that they are supposed to interact with. These hormones will bind to what's called intracellular hormone receptors. These receptors are found either in the cell membrane or they can be floating in the cytoplasm. And the hormone will only affect the cell that has the necessary receptors. So, for example, if erythropoietin is released, the bone marrow will only accept that because it's the only necessary part of the body that is being told to make the red blood cells. And that goes for all of the other hormones that exist within our bodies. Now, the endocrine system can cause two different functions. It could cause an upregulation or it could cause a downregulation. So an upregulation is basically where you have receptors increasing in response to rising hormone levels. So when a hormone level starts to increase because it's being released, then it makes the cell more sensitive to the hormone because it increases the number of receptors for that hormone. And so that upregulates that response. Now, downregulation is the exact opposite, and it leads to a reduction of cellular activity. And so basically your number of receptors will decrease in response to rising hormone levels. So whenever that hormone is released, it's down regulating that process. It's reducing the cellular activity associated with that process itself. Now, there are also glands called exocrine glands. These are different from endocrine glands because they secrete chemicals into ducts that lead outside of the gland, and it doesn't secrete those chemicals into the blood. And an example of an exocrine gland is or are the sweat glands that release sweat to our skin surface that allows us to get rid of heat off the surface of our bodies. Now, the pancreas is really interesting because it has both exocrine and endocrine functions. So its exocrine functions are hormones being released into the digestive system, so not directly into the bloodstream, where it does have an endocrine function where it does release specific hormones into the bloodstream. And we'll talk more specifically about those hormones in a couple of slides. Now, looking at the different glands of the endocrine system, we're going to talk about all of the different glands individually. So the first gland we're going to focus on is the pituitary gland. This gland is located at the base of the brain, so right in here, and is attached to the hypothalamus. And there are two lobes of the pituitary gland. You have a posterior lobe and an anterior lobe. The posterior lobe, it stores and releases oxytocin and antidiuretic hormones. The anterior lobe produces approximately 6 different hormones. So you have your growth hormone, your luteinizing hormone, which we talked about in the reproductive system, as well as the follicle stimulating hormone that was discussed in the reproductive system, so that FSH. Then you have thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and then prolactin. And we'll talk a little bit more about thyroid, adreno, and prolactin hormones later on in this video. Now, the thyroid gland is located in the neck area, and it's actually found just below the larynx. And so the larynx is where your voice box is located, also referred to as the Adam's apple. And the thyroid gland has two lobes that are connected to one another via this isthmus region. So here you have the right lobe and the left lobe of the thyroid gland, and you can notice how it kind of wraps around the trachea right underneath the larynx. Now, the thyroid gland is responsible for synthesizing T4 and T3. So thyroxine and triiodothyronine. Thyroxine, or T4, has 4 atoms of iodine, and T3 has 3 atoms of iodine. Both of these hormones will be released whenever a thyroid stimulating hormone is released from the pituitary gland, right? So we talked about that here. So when that's released from the pituitary gland, it stimulates the release of these two molecules, and it stimulates metabolic activity and energy use. Okay. The thyroid gland will also produce calcitonin, and this is produced when calcium is high, and it's used to reduce calcium concentrations within the blood. So it serves as kind of this negative feedback mechanism, and in reality, almost all the hormones are serving and maintaining the homeostasis of the body through negative feedback systems, like we talked about in the last module. Now, there are also parathyroid glands, which are found on the back of the thyroid. So here's a picture of the thyroid, the back view, and you can see the little yellow nodules. Those are your parathyroid glands. The average person has 4, but they can range anywhere from 2 to 6, depending on the individual. Now, the parathyroid glands, it produces the parathyroid hormone, and it is responsible for affecting blood calcium levels. All right, so the next endocrine gland we're going to look at are the adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands are located on the upper areas of the kidney, and They're basically separated into two different regions. So you have the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. Okay. The adrenal cortex is responsible for releasing the aldosterone. And if you remember from our discussion with the urinary system, aldosterone allows for diluted and concentrated urinary or concentrated urine to be formed, which helps to regulate water volume and also regulate the amount of salts that are in our body. The adrenal cortex will also produce the um, corticoids, which affects the blood glucose levels. And they also affect or they also release androgenins, which are various forms of sex hormones. Now, the second part of the adrenal gland, which is the adrenal medulla, is responsible for the release of hormones that are associated with your fight or flight responses. And so these are related to that sympathetic area of the nervous system. Now, you can have epinephrine, which is adrenaline, or norepinephrine, which is noradrenaline. And again, those are affecting whether or not your body is kind of ramping up for that fight or flight response, or if it's, settling down for like a period of rest. Now, the last organ we're going to talk about is the pancreas and the gonads. First, the pancreas is located between the stomach and the small intestine. And this is responsible for releasing insulin and glucagon, which helps to regulate the blood glucose levels within our body. The gonads, whether they're male testes or female ovaries, are responsible for androgenins, so hormones like testosterone, and then the release of estrogen and proestrogen, um, depending on so just responsible for releasing estrogen and progesterone. Okay. Now, these are the major glands and organs of the endocrine system, but there are other organs that have primary functions that aren't endocrine functions, but they do possess some sort of way to release hormones that help regulate certain cellular processes. So these are like the hearts, the kidneys themselves, the intestines, the thymus, and then adipose tissue, so fat tissue. And so, for example, the heart, the aorta can actually tell whenever it's stretching due to, say, increased blood pressure. And it can release specific hormones that can cause the pressure to go down. And so its primary function is to pump blood, but it also has that secondary role of helping to maintain, homeostasis through like molecule secretion. Now, here we have a figure that comes from your book that shows the endocrine gland and the associated hormones and the effects that they have. Okay. And so, for example, your pancreas has insulin and glucagon or glucagon, which is responsible for glucose levels. You have your adrenal, which is like epinephrine, norepinephrine. So that's your fight or flight responses. Your adrenal cortex is aldosterone, cortisol, which is glucose levels, and also affects sodium levels in the body. So again, through the urinary system. Your parathyroid is that parathyroid hormone that affects calcium levels. Thyroid is calcitonin, which is affecting calcium levels as well. Then you have your T3 and T4 stimulating metabolism. Your pituitary has your antidiuretic, which is helping water absorption in kidneys, oxytocin. This stimulates contractions during childbirth. And then you have all of your hormones from the pituitary anterior area. So, for example, things we've really talked about are like your FSH or your LH, so gamete production in both males and females. Your LH affects it affects both males and females as well, and so on and so forth for the rest of your hormones. And now, what we also mentioned with the endocrine system is that a lot of the hormones affect the body's processes as a negative feedback system. And so, for example, the hypothalamus will release um, TRH, which will cause TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, to be released, which causes thyroid hormones T3 and T4 to be released. But then there's a feedback that happens where you get the anterior pituitary gland seeing the production and then reducing the amount of TRH that's released so that the body only makes a certain amount of T3 and T4 and releases that, so that you don't get too much of an increased metabolism, right? And so the presence of the hormones in the blood to T3 and T4 is what's providing that negative feedback, telling the anterior pituitary gland to turn off the TRH, and then it turns off everything downstream. But now, whenever these T3 and T4 concentrations go down and aren't detected in the blood, then the negative feedback will shut off, TRH will be released, and then the whole process will start again. And then when T3 and T4 increase back in concentration, negative feedback will turn back on and prevent that from stimulating anymore. Okay, and so that's it for our brief overview for the endocrine system. The next section we will look at will be a little more lengthier, in terms of looking at the skeletal system and the muscular system. And so we're going to look at those two body systems in the next video for the module. All right, so I hope you learned a lot from this video, and we'll see you in the next.